The old barrows at Sutton Hoo in East Anglia had attracted grave robbers for years. No one knew exactly how old they were. In 1860, a team of explorers dug into the Roman mounds and recovered 2 bushels of iron rivets that were given to a local blacksmith to be forged into horseshoes. In 1926, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Pretty and his wife Edith bought the Sutton Hoo house that had recently been built near the burial mounds. Frank died on his 56th birthday in 1934, 3 days after Christmas. Exactly what prompted Edith Pretty to investigate the old mounds on her property is the subject of much speculation. It is known that she developed an interest in spiritualism and had some dealings with a medium. It is popularly believed that either Mrs. Pretty or a friend would see ancient warriors milling about on the mist-covered mounds, and there is a story of a dream in which Mrs. Pretty saw an ancient warrior plunge a sword into one of the mounds, and then he told her to dig. It is entirely possible that Edith Pretty simply had a curiosity in the history of the barrows, stemming from her travels to Egypt or her time excavating a Cistercian monastery with her father in her youth. Whatever the case, in 1937, Mrs. Pretty sought the services of a local archaeologist at the Ipswich Museum. The curator recommended a local, self-taught archaeologist by the name of Basil Brown. Mrs. Pretty asked Mr. Brown to dig in the large mound. Instead, he decided to dig in the smaller mounds, because the large ones showed signs of looting in previous centuries. After finding a few fragments of artifacts, Basil Brown decided to excavate the large mound in 1939. What he found is one of the most spectacular and important discoveries in British archaeology. Inside the mound, Brown uncovered the rivets and imprint of an Anglo-Saxon ship, the timbers having long rotted away in the acidic soil. In the center of the vessel was a burial chamber for an East Anglian king. The body, like the planks of the ship, had long ago dissolved into the earth, but many magnificent artifacts remained. Among the various weapons, drinking horns, tools, and items of garnet and gold, the helmet of a warrior king, reminiscent of the tales of the great Anglo-Saxon hero Beowulf, stood out, and has since become a silent icon to the history of the English people. While unusually lavish, this particular type of burial is typical for an Anglo-Saxon king of the early 6th century. Among the pagan trappings, however, was something different. Buried by the king's head were several silver bowls, and 2 silver spoons of Byzantine origin, with the names of Saul and Paul inscribed on them in Greek. These artifacts are believed to be associated with the baptism of the occupant of the tomb. The recovery of the overtly Christian artifacts found in a position of honor and personal importance in a pagan-style burial raises several questions. Why were these items placed in the tomb? What was their significance to the deceased, and who was he? To come to a satisfactory answer, the history and population of the region must be understood. When Claudius began his invasion of Britain in AD 43, not much was known about the local Britons. There had been some contact and trade with these Celtic people with the civilized Mediterranean world, and Julius Caesar had been to Britain twice in 55 and 54 BC during the Gallic Wars. Although some agreements had been made, by the time of Claudius, relations between the Romans and the Britons had degraded. This invasion was simply a war of conquest. Claudius was determined to make Britain Roman. By the end of the 1st century, most of Britain was under Roman control. After quelling the initial uprisings, the Romans began to go about the business of Romanizing their conquest. The local Briton chiefs enjoyed the wealth and status brought to them by their occupiers. The Romans brought order, infrastructure, and new opportunity to Britain. Roman settlements and cities began to appear across the countryside of Britain, and the native Britons quickly adopted many of the manners and customs of the Romans. Although the exact timing of the introduction of Christianity to Roman Britain is debated, it is clear that there was some early influence. Tertullian wrote in his Adversus Judaeos, "For upon whom else have the universal nations believed, but upon the Christ who is already come? For whom have the nations believed? the diverse nations of the Gauls and the haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ. While the Romans were mainly worshipping their own gods at this point, Christianity was spreading throughout the empire. 3 early Christian martyrs in Britain are Aaron, Julius, and Alban. The dates of the martyrdom for these Christians are unknown, but are believed to be in the opening years of the 4th century for Aaron and Julius, while St. Alban could have died more than 50 years earlier in the mid-3rd century. St. Bede the Venerable writes of the death of Alban, "Here, therefore, the head of the undaunted martyr was struck off, and here he received the crown of life which God has promised to them that love him. But he who laid impious hands on the holy man's neck was not permitted to rejoice over his dead body, for his eyes dropped on the ground at the same moment as the blessed martyr's head fell." A few traces of Romano-British Christian art and architecture are uncovered from time to time in the archaeological record, including several depictions of the Key Row, some found in a hoard of gold and silver, and one painted on the wall of a villa, one of the only known Christian paintings from Roman Britain. Somewhere near the end of the Roman occupation of Britain, one Christian left an indelible green mark on Romano-British Christianity. This man was Patrick. According to his Confession of St. Patrick, his father was a deacon and his grandfather was a priest. Patrick himself was not a believer in Jesus Christ. He was captured by Irish brigands at the age of 16 and forced into a life of slavery, tending sheep. Patrick came to Christ and through a vision escaped. Patrick studied to become a priest and in another vision heard the call to return to Ireland as a missionary. Patrick was instrumental in spreading Christianity among the Irish. In AD 410, Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome. The Germanic tribes of barbarians were on the move and Rome was spread thin. Rome recalled their forces from various remote frontier outposts, including Britain. The Britons were once again left on their own to fend for themselves against the Pictish tribes to the north. However, there was another group of warlike invaders moving in from the east. These were the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, who were about to change the island of Britain forever. Hollywood often depicts the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain as fierce, yellow-bearded warriors carrying axes and swords, burning, raping, and pillaging the land in wanton disregard for human life. The Arthurian legends add romance to the idea of a Romano-British chieftain and his knights protecting Britain from the hordes of evil pagans. The reality is a bit less cinematic. Evidence of great battles is scant. The current prevailing theory is that the Britons hired Saxon warriors to protect them from their enemies, as the absence of the Roman legions left them vulnerable to their enemies from the north and the raiders from Ireland. While there is some evidence of violent clashes between the Anglo-Saxons and the local Britons, it appears that these mercenaries liked the land and stayed, bringing in their families and becoming chieftains and kings in their own rights, while anglicizing the native Britons. The Anglo-Saxons were made up of a variety of tribes from northern Europe. These tribes were the Saxons in northern Germany, the Angles from the region of the modern German-Danish border, the Utes from northern Denmark, and the Frisians from the coastal areas of the Netherlands. Of course, these modern nations did not exist at the time. They came from a common ancestry in times past and shared a culture of art, warfare, and religion. They also spoke various dialects of a common language, a language that would come to be known as Old English. This language used the Futhorc runic script rather than the Roman alphabet. These pagan warriors sailed from their Germanic shores, bringing their pagan gods with them to the land of the Britons. The power vacuum left by the retreating Romans was quickly filled by the Anglo-Saxons, and the gods of Rome, along with the Christ of Christianity, were soon forgotten, replaced by the cold, warlike gods of the northern tribes. The English language still retains the names of these deities in our days of the week. Tuesday is the day of Tew, or Tyr. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is named after Thor, while Friday belongs to Woden's wife, Frigga. Little did these mighty and proud warriors realize that their entire way of life was about to be changed by the tender heart of a humble monk named Gregorius. Gregorius, of course, is the monk-turned-pope Gregory the Great. Pope Gregory I wrote a good bit about slavery and the relationship between slaves and masters. In his writings, Gregory makes it clear that he is interested in the souls of both masters and slaves. He believed that men are born free. He expressed this when he wrote, "It is good if men, whom from the beginning nature brought forth as free, and the law of nations subjected the yoke of slavery, should be returned by the benefit of manumission to that liberty in which they were born." In 595, Gregory tasked the rector of Gaul to purchase teenage Anglian boys at the slave market to be converted and sent to monasteries for training. Many scholars believe that these boys were intended to be sent to Britain as missionaries to their people. One story that is popular with a number of variations is that Gregory once saw some slave boys with striking features and beautiful golden hair. He asked where the boys were from and was told that they were Angles and that they were typical of the inhabitants of Britain. Gregory is said to have answered, "Not Angles, but angels." When Gregory was told that their people were pagans, the Venerable Bede records that he remarked, "Alas, what pity that the author of darkness should own men of such fair countenances, and that with such grace of outward form their minds should be void of inward grace." Gregory planned a missionary journey to the Angles and Saxons in Britain the same year that he had the Anglian teenagers purchased from the slave market. The missionaries would be sent to the Kingdom of Kent under King Ethelbert. Some scholars have debated as to why Gregory chose Kent as a starting point for the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. While the answer is not readily apparent in any historical writings, several theories have been put forth. It could be as simple as Kent's location at the narrowest point of the English Channel across from the European mainland. One theory that makes some amount of sense is that the wife of Ethelbert, Bertha, was already a Christian, and her husband allowed her to worship Christ freely. Bertha was a Merovingian princess, born in the Frankish kingdom located in modern-day France. Sometime before AD 588, she and Ethelbert were married. The king allowed his wife to bring Leodard, a Christian bishop, with her to be her personal chaplain. Ethelbert even restored a Romano-British church near Canterbury for her worship. In AD 595, Gregory selected Augustine to lead his missionary journey. He sent a group of around 40 monks and priests to accompany Augustine. Shortly after departing from Rome, the missionaries began to fear what the Anglo-Saxons might do to them upon their arrival in Britain. At some point, the men sent Augustine back to Gregory. The Pope provided Augustine with letters to Frankish clergy in order that translators and priests who were familiar with the Anglo-Saxon culture might join them. In AD 597, Augustine and his fellow missionaries landed in the Kingdom of Kent. They secured a meeting with Ethelbert, who would only meet with the missionaries out of doors. Bede writes, "The king came to the island, and sitting in the open air, ordered Augustine and his companions to come and hold a conference with him. For he had taken precaution that they should not come to him in any house, lest by so coming, according to the ancient superstition, if they practiced any magical arts, they might impose on him and so get the better of him. But they came endued with divine, not magic power, bearing a silver cross for their banner, and the image of our Lord and Savior painted on a board, and chanting litanies, and preached to him the word of life." The king was not converted that day, but he did allow Augustine and his troop to preach the gospel to his people and promised to supply the missionaries with their needs. He gave them quarters in Canterbury from where they based their operations. The missionaries decided to win Ethelbert over through their testimony. They began to imitate the apostolic life of the early church. They prepared themselves for the possibility of martyrdom and lived their lives in constant prayer, fasting, and putting away the comforts of earthly life. Augustine was proclaimed the Archbishop of the Angles. The lifestyle of the missionaries paid off. Not only was Ethelbert convinced to become a Christian, but his subjects were turning to Christ at a rapid rate. It is recorded by Bede and supported in letters by Gregory that the missionaries were performing the sort of miracles that had not been seen since the days of the apostles. This was recognized by all involved to have been something unusual. While the early days of the Gregorian mission saw remarkable success and many converts, the situation would go through several ups and downs before the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would unify as a Christian nation. Augustine and his fellow missionaries would continue their work in Canterbury, establishing a monastery, a school, and churches throughout Ethelbert's kingdom. According to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Augustine died on the 26th of May in the year 604, only 9 years after arriving in Kent. Augustine's time on the mission field was short, but fruitful. As a result of the conversion of King Ethelbert, those kings who owed him fealty also converted. One of those pagan warrior kings was a man named Redwald, king of East Anglia and heir of the Wuffa dynasty. After his conversion, Redwald began to have second thoughts, and according to Bede, hedged his bets by placing 2 altars in his temple, one to Christ and another to the pagan gods of his ancestors. Unwilling to let go of his traditional beliefs, Redwald died around AD 624. Coins found in the Sutton Hoo ship burial in East Anglia date the burial to between AD 610 and 625. Redwald is considered by most historians to be the leading contender for the occupant of the barrow. Could this pagan ship burial, with Christian baptism spoons, be a representative icon of the shift from the darkness of Anglo-Saxon paganism into the spiritual light of Christianity?